Sanctioning Iran. Tehran braces for U.S. sanctions as President Trump declares he just wants world peace. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The U.S. reimposes sanctions against Iran. Everything from airplanes to oil and even gold is affected. The sanctions went into effect midnight Tuesday, with the U.S. president taking to Twitter, calling them the most biting sanctions ever. The U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal earlier this year, and this latest round of retaliation against Iran raises questions about whether the international agreement can survive. Joining us now for more, Negar Mortazavi is Washington correspondent for Iran International. From Beijing, Shindo Xu is a senior researcher at the Pangol Institution. Also with us in the studio, John Sitilides is a global risk analyst at Trilogy Advisors, and Nathan King is White House correspondent for us right here at CGTN. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Negar, the U.S. has reimposed those sanctions that were lifted after that nuclear deal was signed, and as we just heard, the sanctions affect currency, precious metals, carpets, healthcare, automobiles as well. How serious is this for Iran and, most importantly, for ordinary Iranians?
Well, this is pretty serious. The Iranian economy has been spiraling downward, and this is just going to add to this sting. But we shouldn't forget the most biting sanctions are actually supposed to kick off in November, which includes oil, which is what Iran is most concerned about. But these sanctions are going to have a toll on the economy. They're symbolic because it includes not only the car industry, but also aviation. Iranians haven't been able to buy civilian airplanes for decades, and this was an important part of it for, I would say, people of all walks of life, all political and social classes. And now that's going to be stopped, and it's going to have a symbolic effect on the Iranian populace, but also the value of the Iranian rial has been going down, and we've just seen mass protests in Iran continuing, they're ongoing, and it's definitely not going to help the situation of the economy, and it's going to get worse, of course.
John, let's listen to what the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said in response to this reimposition of sanctions. Let's watch.
صداش این هست که نشون بده واقعا میخواد با مذاکره مسئله حل بشه.
What's the meaning of negotiations when you impose sanctions at the same time? It's like someone pulling a knife to stab a rival or an enemy in the arm, while at the same time claiming we should be talking and negotiating. The answer in such a case would be to say, remove the knife from the arm and put the knife away. That person should come to the negotiating table and be logical about negotiating. So I think the real purpose here is to engage in psychological warfare, to sow division among Iranians, while at the same time gaining political capital for the upcoming congressional elections.
So, John, the Iranian president's view there is that this is political. This is all being done in the run-up to the congressional elections. That's the one thing. And the other is, isn't President Trump's actions very damaging to U.S. credibility?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that many American voters who will be considering their congressional ballot are going to be thinking about Iran sanctions. So I would disagree with that perspective, that it's going to have any serious impact in November. In terms of President Trump's position, he was very clear about this during the 2 years of the presidential election, the campaign, and obviously very clear with all of his rhetoric over the first year and a half of his presidency that he was going to be targeting Iran unless the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians were able to put together a better deal. They've been unable to do so. And there have been a number of criticisms about the fact that Iran was supposedly in compliance with the deal. But that really hasn't been what's been most important to the president. He considers it a bad deal because of all the things that Iran has been able to do involving ballistic missile development, uranium enrichment, malign activities involving terrorism in the region, support for Assad, that are all outside the confines of the deal.
Point is, instead of scrapping this deal entirely, wouldn't it have been better if he kept the deal and then tried to improve on it?
He feels that it's a more masterful negotiating position to scrap the deal and force their hand at the table. This is what he's done his entire life. And one of the things that we keep reminding ourselves as we observe the Trump administration in play is that he doesn't do things the way politicians would normally do them. And it's still very difficult for many of us observing this administration a year and a half in, that this is the way he's probably going to continue his administration, the way he feels he should, not the way it's traditionally been done.
Nathan, we're hearing that term regime change. We heard it, we haven't heard it from the administration. John Bolton went out of his way to say that this is not about regime change, although we do hear it from senior Republicans like Senator Lindsey Graham talking about regime change. What is this about?
I was on a background call with the White House on Monday as they sort of rolled this out, and it kind of reminded me of the language that was used in the run-up to the Iraq War. Okay, we didn't have, the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud, or the most dangerous man in the most dangerous region like we had with Saddam Hussein. But the language was pretty similar, but they went out of their way to say this is not about regime change, this is about regime behavior change. But at the same time, they're also trying to draw this weird alliance between the Trump administration and the Iranian people, that somehow you're on the streets and your ideals reflect our ideals. And that has failed nearly every administration, as we know, in the last 40 years. So there is this feeling in the air. And also look at the people around Trump. John Bolton, as you know, very hawkish on Iran, has talked about regime change a lot. Mike Pence as well, the vice president, whose influence on the president is perhaps underestimated. So, and look at also what's going to happen. In the next few months, especially if oil sanctions are reestablished and they can't export as much oil, there is going to be an Iranian reaction. Where is that Iranian reaction going to be? And given the tensions already in the Middle East, what's going to happen? So, I think there is definitely a feeling here of an opportunity by the White House, if they're not even going to do regime change, maybe something will come about where something can happen.
Okay, let's bring in Shindo Shu. He's in Beijing. And Shindo, China is also a signatory to that Iranian nuclear deal and also imports a lot of Iranian oil. Looking at what's going on here in Washington, what's the view from Beijing?
Well, from China's point of view, China has been putting emphasis on honoring the UN resolutions. This is a part of this UN framework, and reached by the biggest powers in the world. P5+1 and with Iran. So for China, it is important to honor the deal. And secondly, for China, that is like China basically make it very public. China will continue to import oil from Iran. Chinese import represent some less than like 25% of the Iranian export. So that will help to some extent with the Iranians in their weathering over the sanctions from the United States. And also, if you look at, interestingly, look at the futures market of China, there's a yuan-denominated oil futures contract. On Tuesday, the market reacted to the news of sanctions with very strong growth, like a growth of 5%. That's the limit of the growth, daily growth. So there's the market somehow there's a confidence that there's good news for the for the Chinese yuan or the Chinese import of oil, because that will cut the cost of exchanging into dollars because people are using yuan. And secondly, it will help expand the use of yuan, with the U.S. sanctions actually.
John, the Chinese have made it very clear they will continue to import Iranian oil. China has its own interests as well. How does the U.S. Deal with that?
Almost every party that opposes the Trump administration's position has maintained that it will continue to seek to do business with Iran until the sanctions actually kick in. And you'll see this happening in Europe over the next several days, where the governments are saying they're looking to keep the deal alive, and then the company lawyers at all of these major corporations who are not going to risk business with the United States will force their companies to comply with the sanctions. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with China later on this year when the oil sanctions kick in, and the degree to which the Chinese government will really see a number of companies foregoing business with the United States in order to be able to continue doing business and importing oil from Iran. That's going to be a fascinating development, and I think there's great flux here. I'm not so convinced that those positions will remain in place midnight after those sanctions are imposed.
This is the White House line, and they heard it on the call. Forget the European carve-out and the protections. Hundreds of multinationals are already leaving Iran. It's going to struggle. It's going to fall. They've been saying that all week. The problem is the US has pulled out of probably one of the best agreements we have ever seen in terms of non-proliferation. And you have all the other major powers in the world that sign on to this still wanting to back it. Yes, companies and lawyers are going to say, let's pull out. But when you have nation states and the European Union all saying, no, we want to stick by this deal, because they know that if they don't, Iran could be free to pursue nuclear energy. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. You know, everyone says it's nuclear weapons. They never got there. So what's going to happen? It's actually not just about business for the European Union, for China, for Russia, for others. It's about keeping a non-proliferation agreement that everyone agrees except on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Nicole, can this deal, known as the JCPOA, can it survive without the United States?
Well, it really depends on how Iran can basically convince the Europeans and also the other parties, but Iranians are banking a lot on Europe, on continuing the business and the economic benefit that they were expecting from the deal. The European governments, the E3, the EU, have come out pretty strong politically. They've done, as even Iranian President Rouhani said, the maximum of what was possible to do. But then when you come look at private companies, especially larger companies that also have business with the US, and that's important for them, it's going to be a two-sided game, and we have to see how much of it Iranians are going to accept. It's definitely not going to give them as much benefit as if the US didn't enact the sanctions, but this sanctions regime is not going to be as successful as during President Obama, who had the international community behind him, basically.
But there are big European companies, as you pointed out, that have already pulled out. Total, for instance, big French energy company pulled out. Maersk, the Danish company, big shipping company, they pulled out as well.
They are, because these are private companies. European governments can't really force them to do business with Iran. Right. And then the sting of U.S. sanctions, the designation of the world's most strongest economy, it's important. And it's not only Europeans. There are also Asian companies or South Korean companies who are talking about pulling out. So there's going to be a diversity of companies who will, probably the larger ones of pulling out, and then the medium-sized or the smaller companies will probably stay and continue in some way.
John?
This whole issue is fascinating in so many different dimensions, Anand. First of all, the business that European companies do with the United States utterly dwarfs the business that they do with Iranian companies. In the end, I really don't see any significant decision to be made here. Maybe politically there is, but economically and financially, those companies are beholden to their shareholders. And they're going to make the best financial decisions on behalf of their shareholders in their own interests. But what's fascinating here is, in many ways, even though we've been focusing, I don't mean to digress here, on the North Korea denuclearization issue for the last year and a half, the sanctions on Iran, when the oil sanctions kick in, will be tougher than what the president has imposed on North Korea, which in many ways poses a more direct threat to American interests.
They won't be, because the rest of the world won't go along. Total maybe pulled out. Guess who took over Total's investment? PetroChina. It was in a contract. So I'm just saying, you think, you know, the White House is saying, oh, this is all going to be fine. Look, you know, we control the global economy, acting like, you know, the sheriff in the town. Right. But actually, we haven't seen that yet. And let's wait and see, because there are a lot of people who think this is not just about money and oil, but about keeping a region safe and a non-proliferation agreement in place.
Let's listen to the European Union Foreign Policy Chief, Federica Mogherini. She had this to say. Let's watch this.
We are doing our best to keep Iran in the deal, to keep Iran benefiting from the economic benefits that the agreement brings to the people of Iran, because we believe that this is the security interests of not only our region, but also of the world. If there is one piece of international agreements on nuclear non-proliferation that is delivering, it has to be maintained.
John, could there be a bigger division between Europe and the United States on this issue?
It almost doesn't matter right now, because we keep making this a bilateral issue between the United States and Iran, and it's not. It also involves our allies in the Middle East. The Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Israelis, they all want to see Iranian power minimized, if not diminished. Their activities in Syria and in Iraq, their activities in Yemen, and under the Obama administration, which did the deal with the Iranians, Iran was the world's worst state sponsor of international terrorism, and yet they were still able to get the deal with Washington. And so there's a whole array of interests here that are looking to see how to contain Iranian influence, its malign activities throughout the Middle East. And so it's not just bilateral. We can talk about some European countries that are at odds with the U.S., but our Middle Eastern allies, the Sunni governments in Israel, are 100% behind this policy.
But they're not just some European companies. They're the U.S.'s closest and strongest allies, and this is just driving a wedge. But as the White House also says, there's the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis who agree with the White House on this.
But backing the Saudis, the Israelis, essentially raises the temperature so much in the region that what you're basically looking at is some sort of war. I mean, this is one of the reasons that the JCPOA was actually negotiated in the first place, because the alternative was a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. The Saudis have said, look, we'll take the Pakistan plans and build our own bomb. Yeah. We paid for it anyway. You know, I mean, so this is one of the reasons the JCPOA was made. Now, there was a hint by the Obama administration that they thought Iranian behavior in the region was going to be different. Exactly. Syria hadn't exploded to the extent we've seen. But at least that one leg of the three-legged stool was going to be put away. Let's talk about ballistic missiles. Let's talk about regional hegemony between the Saudis and the Iranians and their proxies. But at least the most dangerous of the things that could happen in the Middle East, a nuclear arms race or a nuclear accident or a miscalculation, the fire of a nuclear weapon, could be put in the box. And that's why the JCPOA was so important.
But the Trump style is to maximize the leverage that you have available to you on the other side. The U.S. is doing it with China, it's doing it with North Korea, it's doing it with Russia and Ukraine.
And how's that working for him?
We're going to see.
Okay.
He says.
I want to get Shindo back in from Beijing. Shindo, President Trump posted this tweet early on Tuesday morning. It says, and I'm quoting here, "The Iran sanctions have officially been cast. These are the most biting sanctions ever imposed, and in November they ratchet up to yet another level. Anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. I am asking for world peace, nothing less." So, Shindo, how will that statement be heard in Beijing?
Well, obviously, you know, Beijing has been opposing this unilateral approach by the Trump administration. This is just another case and in point of the U.S. unilateralism. You know, there is an international commitment to protect the economic interests of Iran in exchange for the Iranian concession of developing nuclear technology over there. But now it's the U.S. Which abandoned the whole piece of agreement, and you know, despite the opposition of the whole world. And secondly, you know, this message, this tweet, basically the U.S. is developing from threatening Iran, a single country, now is threatening or is bullying the rest of the world. Anybody doing business will face a consequence from Washington. This is, I think, put the U.S. in the morally weakest probably position. The U.S. is fighting the whole world. The U.S. is being isolated. Yes, the U.S. is powerful, but morally, I think it's hardening the Iranians, their attitudes toward Iran. And, you know, also, I agree with my colleague, talked about this. It's not purely about economic issue. It's also about the security. I think European countries, they are rightly concerned about what if there is a regime change, if the Iranians sink into chaos. Are they going to face the refugees? Who is going to take care of the chaos? I don't think this is good to the regional countries, to European countries, to the whole world.
Nico, I just want to get back to Trump's tweeting. I mean, that's how he makes these public announcements. In fact, but the Iranian foreign minister, in this instance, also tweeted his response. The foreign minister said, reminder, international relations is not a beauty pageant with tired cliches about a desire for world peace, and it is not the first time that a warmonger claims he is waging war for quote-unquote world peace. So have the Iranians got into Twitter diplomacy as well now?
Well, the foreign minister definitely has, and the tweet also before that he talked about sticking to the JCPOA, and the deal was a little bit more harsh than what President Rouhani was putting out. What President Rouhani put out, he didn't completely deny the suggestion by President Trump of meeting or of negotiating or cutting in on a deal, but he said you can't do it if there are sanctions. So he's basically putting out also his condition on the table that you need to remove these sanctions that were already removed because of a deal, and then the Iranians might come back to the table. There's also an internal debate in Iran on whether they should take up President Trump's offer. The fact that he offered to negotiate without any preconditions makes it appealing to the Iranians, but there's going to be a very high political cost if they come to the table with President Trump with the condition that he has created.
Nathan?
Zarif is an extremely able negotiator, and I thought something he pointed out in the last 24 hours has been really interesting. It's like, you want to talk about this now? Did you not look at what we did for years? We met everywhere around the world. We negotiated this agreement down to the last comma, the last piece of grammar. Do you think you're going to get anything better? I mean, so many times the Obama administration or the French or some other entity nearly walked away from the Iran nuclear deal because they didn't think it was enough. But in the end, after years of negotiations and years of sanctions, plus international cohesiveness at the UN, in the European Union, in the Arab League, in the Greater Middle East, in Asia, everyone coming together and putting their stamp on this deal. And if the Trump administration thinks they can get better by basically reimposing sanctions without this international cohesiveness they had before, well, good luck, because the Iranians probably know they won't be able to.
John, is this about a better deal?
Well, first of all, absolutely. In Trump's own mind, he's going to get a better deal because he criticized the Obama administration for entering into an agreement, which was never ratified by the Senate, right? This was simply a handshake, a figurative handshake between President Obama and the Iranian leadership.
Both sides are legally obliged.
It passed the UN Security Council, so it is internationally binding, but that's fine.
Which is not beholden
Not to the Senate,
another president. And Senator Tom Cotton, a number of Republican senators, warned the Iranian government in 2015. This has no binding power if a Republican wins in 2016.
But having said that, bomb Iran, by the way.
Okay. So I think the larger issue over here is also the way Trump uses the Twitter feed to communicate messaging. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that he's simply not a conventional politician. On this, I have to defer to the creator of the comic strip Dilbert, Scott Adams, who's one of the most astute observers of how Trump seeks to persuade. And his theory is that Trump isn't really looking to get into exact policy communications. It's really more a matter of direction. What are we going to be talking about after this tweet? Who's stronger in favor of world peace, the United States or Iran? That's what Trump is communicating over here. Not whether or not the policy is exactly correct this way or that way, but the larger debate is who is a force for world peace? And I think Trump believes that the U.S. is going to win that debate.
He's communicating to his base, and he's doing it successfully on Twitter.
I agree. It's not to, I'm sorry, putting some sort of theory behind this is giving the president, I think, having covered him and talked to his staff and people at the White House a little bit too much credence. He fires off when he feels like it. I agree. He talks to his base, but as we saw with the whole Russia interference debate, he says something on Twitter or at a rally. His administration says something different. There are opinions and there are policies, and under this administration, the president goes any which way he wants, while his administration try to come up with a policy. That may work when you're appealing to your base in a midterm. Right. It does not work in international diplomacy.
Nathan, just one thing. The president has something like 53 million followers on Twitter. Sure. He's already tweeted out 38,000 times. One of the reasons that was put forward when this phenomenon first started was that that's the way he communicates. He bypasses the media.
Well, I mean, Twitter is media, so I don't think he bypassed it at all. I think it's excellent, by the way. We all know exactly what the president is thinking or thinking about doing all the time. One of the big problems with the Obama administration was actually getting any information at all that wasn't pure spin. So in that respect, I think it's a complete improvement. And when the White House says we're the most transparent that we've seen for a long time, I totally agree, and most of it's based on the Twitter feed. The problem is that you can't do policy like that, right, especially when you're working with partners. You saw it at the NATO summit, you saw it in the UK visit, you saw it in Helsinki, I was there. It was baffling. And you cannot build and keep the credibility that the United States has, the leadership role that the United States has when you're tweeting all the time against a lot of your own officials, even and your allies.
Go ahead.
I also want to add that let's not forget that Republicans, part of the Republican Party, were also warning him to not leave the deal when Congress had the 60-day period that they could make this move and get out of the deal. The president first presented basically this opportunity to the Congress. They sent it right back to him and they said, we're not going to do it. The Republicans didn't even put this to vote. So this wasn't something that even was supported by the body of his party, but I guess the base is different, and they like it.
Well, I think you're right, but the base. I think you were right, John. Where not many people in the midterms are going to be about Iran, but there are people around him who want this issue pushed, not just John Bolton, but the
Nathan,
donors.
It may not be about Iran, but isn't Donald Trump making the point that I'm the guy who makes a promise, I'm going to keep it?
Mm-hmm. But when's he kept a promise on the international stage?
No,
where's Korean denuclearization? NATO isn't paying more money. I mean, this is all just
right. But he's projecting strength.
Yeah.
That American voters feel was absent in prior administrations. And that's the issue. So you can get into the minutiae, but voters don't sit there debating it this way.
Yeah, but if you say tear down this wall and it doesn't happen, then it doesn't look like strength.
It took several years for that to happen. Let's see how this all materializes. But I think it's very important to also distinguish between criticism of the Trump administration, which is fairly widespread, including in the United States, and the kind of sentiment that says, there's really no value going forward over here. He brought this style into the presidency. And whether people disagree with him or agree with him, this has worked for him to a considerable degree.
In what way?
He's president of the United States. Simple as that.
No, but in what way since he became president
does it work for him? And the thing is that he has significant credibility as opposed to criticism. But the point is, the credibility, I think, is very serious because Xi Jinping knows that Donald Trump has credibility in terms of the trade dispute. Kim Jong-un knows that there is credibility in terms of Trump and the very tight sanctions on North Korea. The Russians know that sanctions have been ramped up on Russia under the Trump administration over Ukraine and other issues.
I disagree.
So it's one thing to say criticism, another thing to say credibility, which is absolutely the case.
All right, let me go to Shinda. Shinda, you've just heard that. Does Donald Trump have that kind of credibility with the Chinese leadership?
Well, it's a very different leadership style, from the. I don't think there's concluding definition about the leadership style, but people tend to characterize Trump administration with like a Twitter governance, literally translated from the Chinese. It's very different, but for the Chinese, it's always about the planning, it's about the being consistent, it's about good governance. But so I guess it will take time to see the result, the consequence. It has reached some, I would say, achieved some unexpected results, like the Korean nuclear issue, and like in the even the trade war, like say with the truce with the European Union. But also it created a lot of chaos and trouble.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. You've been watching The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.